Addressing Gettysburg.
I'll throw you some questions as they come up, and that's it.
Okay, so if you're just going to ask it that way, it's going to be a long answer. So,
like a 15-minute answer?
No, but 5.
Okay.
I mean, if you're just going to say what was his attitude, well, maybe I'll simplify it, and you can follow up.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to start with it, and then usually that leads to other questions.
Okay, got it.
All right, so here we go. Are you rolling and everything's ready over there? All right, here we go.
From the Gettysburg Museum of History Studios, you're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this special edition of Addressing Gettysburg. We are coming to you from the CWI's Summer Conference of 2024. And sitting with me here today is Harold Holzer, the great Lincoln historian. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. It's great to have you on. So your book here, Brought Forth on This Continent, Abraham Lincoln and American Immigration. There's so many books about Lincoln, right? Every aspect of Lincoln.
I've done many.
I know, right? You have, right. Have you done one on which way he'd like to comb his hair? I mean, I think that's the only thing we haven't
covered. I've
written
about it.
You have?
I have. It's part of a book.
Okay.
Yeah, try another one. You'll never get me.
I guess everything's done. Everybody's done everything on Lincoln. But one thing that really intrigued me about this was, immigration and the attitudes towards it. It's a big issue today. And I always wonder, when we're fighting over things today, are the arguments new, or are the arguments old, just repackaged? Because I noticed that with other things, elections and things like that, particularly 64 election. I remember I read a book about it years ago, and it was during the 04 election. And I noticed that a lot of the rhetoric against Lincoln's war was similar to that against Bush's war. And so what was Lincoln's attitude towards immigration at the time? And what was the system like at the time? I think you mentioned something that the Constitution doesn't really give the president or anybody,
right.
Go into that first.
Well, the Constitution gave the power over naturalization to the federal government. Okay. Didn't mention immigration. So implicitly, it went to the states, and the states kind of regulated entrance, meaning if you were indigent, you had, they didn't really want you. So everybody had to pay $1 a head tax to prove that you've got money. And if, they collected the money and used it for the poorhouses for immigrants if necessary. But other than that, there were very few obstructions. You could come in on a ship. You were obliged to sign your name and give your country of origin. 5 years later, under most state rules and under a rule that Congress had adopted, you could go in and become an American citizen without the kind of rigorous test that new Americans undergo now, that I don't think most of us could pass. No. They are really tough. Yeah. Plus an oath of allegiance that's really chilling.
Right.
So it was simple. But to what you said earlier about whether the current conflict is new, it certainly isn't. It's old. It's original. It goes back to Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and George Washington saying, maybe we made a mistake here. Adams and Washington, after his presidency, said there are too many foreigners coming in. And many of them are French. And that's terrible, because that's going to help the Democratic Republicans, not the Federalists. So it was political. Adams cracked down on it, and his law required 14 years for citizenship, and then that was overturned or sunset when Jefferson became president. And it was never questioned again until the 1880s. That was the rule. But for sure, resistance. And Lincoln's attitude was complex. Is that surprising about Lincoln?
Yeah, right.
So on the one hand, Every time he spoke publicly on immigrants and immigration, he said there should be no obstructions. There should be an easy path to citizenship. The only thing he added that might be seen as somewhat restrictive, but it was sensible, was that new citizens should learn something about the United States. He said that in 1844. He never said it again. At the same time, he very much preferred German immigrants because they tended to be Republicans. He didn't prefer Irish immigrants because they tended to be Democrats.
Okay.
Unfortunately, most of the pushback in the rest of the country against immigrants was against Catholics. And most of the Catholic immigrants by 1845 were Irish. So there was tremendous violence. Long before the Irish started the draft riot in New York, there were riots against Irish immigrants in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston.
That has to be, from the founding, it had to be a difficult thing to maneuver because the country needed people.
Exactly.
So, I mean, it's a huge piece of land that you eventually want to fill.
Exactly.
And you need people for it. Yet everybody, and I think it's interesting because today it's framed as, not wanting people of a non-white color.
Exactly.
But back then, everybody that they're arguing over was white.
Well, they also argued a bit over Chinese immigration to the West Coast.
Okay.
It was so far away that the arguments took a while to get to Washington. But for sure, white people in California began to worry because at one point, Chinese Californians were a greater number in the population than white settlers. Yeah.
Wow.
And so they pushed back.
Okay.
Even though all of them were laborers who were working in the mines and the railroads. And guess what? Immigrants are the ones who have done this work since the beginning of the 19th century. And I said in my talk to the CWI last night, I actually got emotional about it, thinking about it. Who were the 5 or 6 workers who plunged to their death when the ship hit the bridge in Baltimore Harbor a few months ago, as we speak?
Yeah.
They were undocumented, what anti-immigrant people call illegal, but they were undocumented immigrants. And who else is going to fill potholes at night, right? It's not going to be you. It's not going to be me.
No, I have a bad back. Because
we have other things and I have a bad back, and I'm old. So it's not going to be us.
Right.
These are people who are, just as in the early 19th century, doing work that others, native-born Americans, don't want to do. They're willing to do. They're willing to march up the economic ladder. Mm-hmm. It's been proved over time that that's what immigrants did. My immigrant grandmother couldn't read or write, and her grandchildren are teachers and doctors and lawyers and judges and professors.
Right. Where was your family from?
So 3 of my grandparents were from Ukraine or Poland. They used to say Poland, apparently, but it's Ukraine now. And the grandmother whom I knew was from Romania. Okay. Outside of, actually, she's from Transylvania, but I can't say that.
Yeah, because people think she's Dracula.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or Madame Dracula. But she came here at 14 and worked in a garment factory as a child, as a teenager.
And I would imagine that there was some form of discrimination at first for that first generation when they would come here.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I didn't really speak about, I only knew her till I was 16 years old. And she mostly talked about being American. She loved being American. She kept her old world religious values and never learned English. I mean, she never learned to write or read English. And she would go on New York City's subways. She would be taken by one of her children or in-laws once, and she would learn to count the subway stations on her fingers. So she knew when she got to a hand full of fingers, she was at Crown Heights where I lived, from Bensonhurst where she lived, both in Brooklyn. Yeah. And these people were amazing. Yeah. They adapted, they learned, and they knew they were, even before the Holocaust, they knew they were lucky to be in America. Right.
And that, you said something before that she always said she was American. Yeah. And that was something that my grandparents also did. They were all, except for my grandmother, my one grandmother, they were all first generation Americans, born to Italian or Irish parents. Neither one of them, those groups had a pretty good time when they first got here either. My father had in his office a sign that said, help wanted, Irish need not apply.
Of course.
So, and I thought it was a joke.
Certainly kept immigrants, Jews out, Irish out.
Yeah.
Certainly African Americans out, but
Sure.
we're talking about the immigrant
Right.
experience.
So I just think it's interesting that, that they have such a tough time, but they want to be Americans and they're proud to be
and they
Americans.
want to work.
Yeah.
One quick additional story. I used to work for Governor Mario Cuomo, and his father came from Italy, of course. And he said, my father came here because he heard that the streets were paved with gold. When he got here, he realized that they not only weren't paved with gold, but they were unpaved, and he was expected to pave them. That was his introduction to his father, who had been a ditch digger
Right.
when he came to the United States, and then graduated to opening a grocery store before he knew how to speak English. And a Jewish neighbor taught him to keep books, in return for which young Mario would light the gas stoves of the Jewish neighbors on the Sabbath, because Orthodox Jews are not allowed to light fires on the Sabbath.
Right.
And so Mario did
So
the
he would
work.
go around and do that for them.
For them, yeah.
Wow.
It's sort of a double immigrant story.
Yeah. So
Far from the Civil War, but the stories don't change.
no, that's my point, is that it's all really the same. It's the window dressing that's changed, and the way
Right.
we package the arguments has changed, or hasn't changed.
It hasn't.
Or has changed. Forgive me. Yes.
Well, I think has and hasn't both, right? I
Well,
mean,
yeah.
there is still resistance from people who have been here maybe one or two generations, protecting these shores from, our new people who are walking a continent to get here, really going to poison the blood of the United States?
Right.
Or are they looking for safety and opportunity, as our ancestors did?
What do you think that? I mean, do you think that's a natural human reaction to newcomers,
Yes.
no matter where you go?
Yeah, I do. I mean,
Yeah.
I think you rise and you close up the trapdoor
Right.
that once
Now that I'm in,
threatened you.
you're all out.
You're all out.
Yeah.
Don't come in, because I'm not sure I can maintain my status. So it is natural. It is
Sure.
emotional. It's not, the people who feel this way are not unreasonable or bigots. They're frightened
Right.
of something new, as people were when our ancestors got here. So I just think what the Lincoln story does is help us be aware that it's an old story, that we can overcome the natural distrust and a little bit of discrimination and fear. And also realize, again, that there are lots of jobs in this country that are unfilled, and that immigrant workforces are desperate. Sounds like an anti-union statement. I promise it's not. But I'm from New York, and one of the reasons that many hotels in New York are converting into residence for migrants is not just because there are lots of migrants and not much place for them to be when they get started here, but because there are not enough workers in the hotels to keep restaurants going, to keep the rooms cleaned and turned over. And the response is that they can keep staff levels low by becoming migrant hotels. That's a very small slice of this story, but it's something I see every day in New York.
So back to Lincoln, though. Lincoln is one of these guys where people can make him anything they want him to be, right? And there's this joke about him, being misquoted online all the time in these memes of things he's never said or whatever.
I do a good business in validating quotes for CNN, and most of them are invented. So
Yeah. So his attitude towards immigrants, a lot of times you'll hear, especially people who are more lost causers, they'll look at things that Lincoln said prior to the war about slavery and African Americans, and they'll say, he didn't really love people, and he didn't, care about the slaves. This is what he really thought about it. Not giving the man a chance to evolve as the situation evolves, but sometimes they'll say that he did the Emancipation Proclamation as a war measure, not because he cared about black people.
Right.
What's the reality of all this stuff?
I mean, the reality is, ever since, I think it was George H.W. Bush, or at least Lee Atwater, even though Bush was a good Lincoln man, I give him enormous credit for that. The idea that evolution is flip-flopping. Remember that phrase when that came into the political vernacular?
Yeah.
That it was a sign of weakness,
Yeah. But it was Kerry, right? John Kerry?
Oh, so maybe it was Bush too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was Kerry.
Because everybody was holding up flip-flops at the convention.
Listen, it worked. So,
Yeah, it did.
it was Bush 2 second term.
Yeah,
You're absolutely right.
correct.
So it's a more recent phenomenon. And it became, a badge of dishonor to have grown in your thinking. To which I point people to Ronald Reagan, who was a flaming liberal in the 1940s. He was elected head of the Screen Actors Guild because he was going to fight McCarthyism and the blacklist. And then he evolved into an ardent conservative. God bless.
Yeah.
That's how he evolved.
Right. Because the situation changed, and he found, I don't like the way this is going.
Right.
And he switched. Right.
Well,
which is what people do.
There's an old New York street saying is, a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged.
Yes.
So, but I mean, Lincoln didn't know black people. Getting back to your original question, he had no, the only black people he saw were black people who were chained together on the Ohio River.
Right.
He didn't really see black people until he was 19 or 20 years old when he went to New Orleans on a flatboat excursion and saw a slave auction, which apparently, according to his cousin who was with him on the first of those journeys, inflamed him so much, he said, I'm going to spend my life destroying this institution.
Now, do we believe that, or is that one of the myths?
The problem is, John Hanks was with him on the first journey. This is the cousin who was a myth maker, if there ever was one. The problem is he wasn't on the second journey in New Orleans. So he may have heard it secondhand. It makes sense. I mean, Hanks is also the guy who brought a log rail to the Republican convention in Illinois, and that's where the rail splitter myth.
Right.
And Lincoln looked at the rail and said, well, it may not be a rail that I split, but it's very much like the rails I split. So that story is very much like Lincoln's reaction to slavery. He was always anti-slavery, whether he envisioned a full biracial future, not in the 1830s, not in the 1840s. And if you judge his words, at face value in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, not in the 1850s. But in the final speech he made as president on April 11th, 1865, he's beginning to call for black voting rights. He's the first president to do so. And as I said in my talk last night, John Wilkes Booth is in the audience and vows that's the last speech he'll ever make because it means Negro equality, as he puts it. Or he doesn't use the word Negro, he uses the N-word. So Lincoln is growing. People like Booth don't evolve. He's a racist from beginning to end of the Civil War.
To wrap it up, because I know you want to get back and watch Pete Carmichael, what is it that drew you to Lincoln, that made you devote so much of your life to writing about him?
So for me, it was a fifth grade assignment that fortunately I got the Lincoln assignment out of a grab bag of names.
Okay.
And, I read a book by a man named Richard Nelson Current, who was here on the campus we're speaking from for the 175th anniversary of Lincoln. So what year would that be? 1994. I don't know, whenever, 84. But there was a great conference here at Gettysburg College called Lincoln 175. But I got to know him. He lived to be 100 years old. We had a reunion in Springfield, Illinois, with a Lincoln man named Wayne Temple, who is 100 years old. I think all Lincoln scholars should live to be 100. That's one of my beliefs, that's what happens.
So that's why you chose
that's
it, so
why
you could
I chose
live long.
Longevity. But it's ever fascinating.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have more ideas in my own future, but I've been inspired by accident, by discovery of an archive, by close reading of a painting or a print of Lincoln into the fields of Lincoln image making and Lincoln speeches and Lincoln in the press. And then this book on immigration, as well as my previous book on the presidents versus the press, both evolved out of the 2016 presidential campaign, which the previous year seemed to be all about fake news and immigrants poisoning the blood of America.
Mm-hmm.
So I signed a 2-book deal to do both those topics. I was supposed to do immigration first, and I thought, they're going to settle it really soon. So there's no point in doing it. I did the press. Neither issue is settled.
Right,
Is
right.
news reliable or not? Do immigrants have a place in society, or should they all be deported, including people who were born here and have birthright citizenship? Still out there, so I got to it. And hopefully some spark will ignite for the next one.
Lincoln's mind, to me, is the mind that gave birth to the modern American way of life and society. Mm-hmm. He's just a brilliant guy. So people think, prior to any 20th century presidents that people might know, it's Washington and Lincoln. And very few people can maybe name another president from the 1800s.
Well, I think that's true. He dominated the night. Well, maybe Jackson a little bit. But, every presidential survey, whether it's the popular is a little bit different because Reagan and Kennedy get very high ratings because of their dramatic television presence. But it's always the trinity of Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. And, I'm privileged to spend my work days in Franklin Roosevelt's New York City home, which is much less known than his Hyde Park home.
Oh, wow.
But my place, which is on the Upper East Side of Manhattan and is part of Hunter College, is the place where Roosevelt ran his 2 gubernatorial campaigns and his first presidential campaign. It's where he recovered from polio. It's where he crawled around his den for hours each day to build up his upper body strength so he could maneuver on braces after 1924. And it's where his presidential transition was conducted in one small room, and where the New Deal was created and where Social Security was brainstormed, including and infrastructure, the Works Progress Administration, all of that in one building. So I have a new place in my heart for Roosevelt, but there are plenty of Roosevelt scholars out there. I'm not going to do that.
Right.
And the great continuum for me is that when he was governor of New York, FDR said, it's time that we take Abraham Lincoln for the Democratic Party. And it was the beginning. The Republicans had owned Lincoln through the Gilded Age, through the Depression, through, Taft and TR fighting over whether Lincoln would be a progressive Republican or a traditional Republican.
Right.
And it didn't help that Robert Lincoln hated TR. And through Coolidge and Harding and Hoover, in 1932, black Americans voted majority for Herbert Hoover and the Republicans. There was still that. And Roosevelt is the one who transformed made the party of Lincoln the Democratic Party. It's been thus for 85 years.
It's interesting.
And finally, FDR gives a Gettysburg Address. I mean, what could be better for me? He comes here to dedicate the Peace Memorial.
Yep.
What was it, 1940, I think?
38?
38? Okay. 38, says the audience.
Yes.
It must be 38. And he wrote his address on the train. Lincoln didn't write his Gettysburg.
Oh, really?
But Roosevelt had the luxury liner from Hyde Park here.
Right.
And to close the loop, he actually met Civil War veterans. They were brought to his car, including a member of the U.S. colored troops, still living, 70 years after the battle. It's like these D-Day veterans whom we just saw in Normandy.
I know.
Amazing.
Yeah. All right. I don't want to take up any more of your time. I really appreciate you sitting and talking with us. We were supposed to do it last year, and we didn't get to do it, but I'm glad we got it done this year.
Because you had to send
I didn't have a
people
lack
to
of
retrieve.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. But we got you now. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Harold Holzer. And the book is Brought Forth on This Continent, Abraham Lincoln and the American Immigration. Get a hold of it now. Thank you. All right.